2020, the year of the new coronavirus.
I am officially declaring a national emergency. Two very big words.
The year when killings of black men and women by the police sparked protest in the U.S. and around the world.
We have been enduring years and years of oppression, and we've just had enough.
The year of a fiercely fought U.S. presidential election.
Will you shut up, man?
With an outgoing president reluctant to accept the results.
We've never lost an election. We're winning this election.
A year with a promising start for U.S. China relationship.
Conclusion of the Phase 1 trade agreement between China and the U.S. is good for China, for the U.S., and for the whole world.
But then it took a turn for the worse.
2020, a year like no other.
Hello and welcome to CGTN's Year in Review. I'm Anand Naidu.
And I'm Mike Walter. 2020, a year many people would like to forget, but most of us probably never will.
The COVID-19 pandemic, it dominated our lives.
Every person has been touched in some way by this global health emergency. Gerald Tan reports on the crisis as it unfolded on CGTN.
The pandemic defined so much of our lives in 2020. Here in the Americas, conversations about the coronavirus continually shifted as new challenges emerged. Now, during the early part of the year, one word embodied the collective experience: shortage.
The queue of cars at this testing site continues for as far as the eye can see.
The nurses say in many cases they also have not received enough training to deal with COVID-19 patients.
But this scramble for basic medical supplies has created fierce bidding wars right across the world, sending the price of the N95 masks soaring.
From the outset of the pandemic, Peru's chronically underfunded healthcare system has hindered its response to COVID-19.
The virus has been relentless and indiscriminate. Death numbers continue to soar from one continent to another, with economic and racial disparities exposed.
Latin America has become the world's most infected region, accounting for almost 1/3 of the global caseload.
Freshly dug graves across Brazil. Half of Brazil's 300 indigenous tribes have confirmed infections.
Health experts are calling Brazil's response to the pandemic a complete disaster.
There is another side to the COVID-19 outbreak, affecting tens of thousands of people from Latin America trying to forge a legal path to citizenship. They are non-Mexicans who are now trapped along the Mexico-U.S. border in dangerous cities.
Poorer communities like Brasilândia, social distancing is hard to achieve. Many people live in substandard and crowded houses. Others don't have the means to stop working and properly quarantine.
Vaccines are, however, on the way, but most Americans aren't expected to receive one until well into 2021.
From bustling cities to remote communities, people everywhere are feeling the financial pain of COVID-19.
Broadway theaters remain closed, as do many other cultural venues.
Many New Yorkers have fled the city, and some don't intend on returning.
Unemployment benefits and federal payments to restaurants and their employees helped cushion the blow earlier this year. But some say more stimulus relief is badly needed.
2 years of recession and one of the highest inflation rates in the world. Now, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, Argentina is expected to be one of the hardest hit economies in Latin America.
But from adversity comes creativity, teleconferencing, e-learning, even makeshift face coverings. People around the world have learned to cope and adapt.
Now, you may have to improvise a little bit. I put some tape on those filter sections to make it a little bit easier to put on.
It turns out the gowns, when worn backwards, meet federal health guidelines for medical worker attire. They're able to cover much of the body, including the neck and arms. They can then be zipped from the back to hold the gown securely.
2020 may well go down in history as the year of the coronavirus, with many left asking when and how will the pandemic end. Gerald Tan, CGTN, Washington.
How has COVID-19 affected the United States and Latin America? Well, for answers, let's bring in our panelists. From New York, Dr. Calvin Sun is a practicing attending physician and clinical assistant professor in emergency medicine.
From Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Dr. Paula Hedges is a resident doctor of infectious diseases at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. That's a leading research institution in Latin America.
And Joseph Williams is a senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report, joining us right here in Washington, D.C.
Calvin, why don't I begin with you, because you've had such a roller coaster ride this year. You know, when you think about it, you started the year right there on the front lines, so much death and despair. And you're ending the year, I just heard you got actually a vaccine. So describe for us what this year's been like, and also piece together for us what it's been like in terms of, you know, the psychological toll this is taking on people on the front lines.
I hope they make a movie about this. This has been more than just a roller coaster ride. There's going to be a reckoning. Books, magazines, newspapers, we're going to try to dissect this through and through. And I can say right now that we're still in the middle of it, just coming out of, you know, December and about to round the new year, and having just gotten the vaccination, just only so recently, being one of the first few. It's a surreal moment. I think it's a mixed emotions and mixed bags, as you say, roller coasters, where, you know, in March, we didn't know enough about it, and it was overwhelming. But it was also much more straightforward to manage. You're going home, you're staying, you're sick, you're not sick, you know, stay home, come to an emergency room. Now it's so complicated where people are fatigued by this crisis. So we're mixing in all the complicated patients that we had before COVID, heart attacks, belly pains, abdominal pains, people who are drunk, picked up off the street, people who mix in, who don't care about COVID, also with all the hundreds of people coming in for testing for COVID, and, you know, people who don't believe in it, people who do believe in it. We're exhausted, and this vaccination thing that we're going through right now is a glimmer of hope.
And if I can ask a follow-up, what was that experience like getting the vaccination?
I mean, the video I posted on social media belies an ocean of what do you say, memories, catharsis. I tried to not show that I cried on camera, but deep down it was just an emotional catharsis, if you will. Very, very complicated. We're not sure how well it's going to work. We can never predict the future, but also it's like a sigh of relief after everything we've been through.
Yeah. Paula, let's talk about how medical scientists and professionals have been trying to manage this crisis. You know, one of the things that COVID-19 has done is that it's given these professionals the ability to showcase what they can do. If we look at the research, I mean, just a few months ago, we were told it'll be impossible to get a vaccine by the end of the year. Then we had Operation Warp Speed, and we don't just have one vaccine, we have several vaccines right now. How was it done?
Yeah, I think it's a quite, as said, emblematic year. It's really hard to understand and to really make a balance of everything that has happened in only 1 year and how science has developed so fast. I think that also we still do have more questions than answers, but at least we have great answers as well to give to the people. That is what really matters. So when we say about the vaccines, we have a long history on producing vaccines, studying vaccines, and understanding the importance of having it for public health and for general health. And having this in such a short time, it's a quite impressive thing, and it shows again the importance of believing on science, on trust on scientists, on the importance of having robust data, informative, collective information to give to the population, and also the importance of sharing information. I think we have never seen in such a short year the amount of papers that have been published, but it's also a kind of inner question when that we have, that also the importance of having this critical analysis over this information being released, because this implicates in lives, and time means lives being lost, loves being lost. So I think the importance of having such a short time, but also with so much development, is the solidarity between the scientific community. Because sometimes in the environment that we have scientists, we keep on thinking that it's a running and it's a competition to release something faster, to do better than the other. But right now it's doing faster and doing better for the others. So this is a really emotional moment, and it's a really nice in such year with so much trouble and so many hard situations, also having this positive information to give to the population is quite awesome.
Joseph, it's interesting listening to Paula. I mean, this has been a race for researchers, scientists trying to figure out how to attack this. And then, of course, you've got Calvin talking about what it was like to be on the front lines and witnessing all of this despair and death. And then you've got leaders. And it's interesting as you look at the international map, I mean, different approaches. You had some that were trying herd immunity, others who did lockdowns. You saw leaders get the virus, from Donald Trump to Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, most recently to Macron. So talk to us about how these leaders dealt with this and as they kind of groped around in the dark, just like all the rest of us.
Well, it's interesting because you do have a range of how these leaders dealt with this problem. I mean, first of all, back in March, nobody really understood what we were facing. And if we had, I would argue that there probably would have been a much more robust response from the places that, excuse me, that did not do so well. But if you look at places like New Zealand, Vietnam, some other places in the Far East, they did remarkably well. New Zealand in particular managed to quash this virus in a matter of months, which was quite remarkable. But if you go across the ocean and you look at the United States, you look at Eastern, or rather Western Europe, and even Brazil, you have leaders who did not necessarily lean into what needed to be done for to get this virus under control. Particularly in the United States, we'll start here, but basically the virus became political for a leader who was facing re-election, I should say. Donald Trump, inherently a political animal. I mean, he sees things in transactional kind of a viewpoint. He saw the virus as perhaps something that he didn't need to be worried about that could threaten his election prospects if he decided to take it seriously and lean into it and call for people to make sacrifices and not take this virus lightly. That didn't happen. So when Donald Trump failed to take the virus seriously, his people and the United States kind of basically followed suit. And one of the problems that we had here in the U.S. that I would argue probably did not occur in places like Vietnam or New Zealand is the fact that we had a patchwork. In other words, without strong national leadership, the states were left to fend for themselves, and you ended up with 50 states and 50 different plans to handle this vaccine.
You know, Calvin, as this pandemic swept the world, you know, it was regrettable, as we've just heard from Joseph Williams there, that this crisis became politicized. We saw that here in the United States, we saw it in Brazil, and to some extent we saw that in Europe as well, in the United Kingdom. We saw the infighting that took place in the United States between the federal government and state governments, depending on whether it was a red state or a blue state, Republican or Democrat. And in some instances, leaders did more harm than good. Here's one instance of that.
I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
So, Calvin, I mean, here we had President Trump talking about taking disinfectant to clear the lungs. Now, you as a doctor, as a professional out there in the field, how did that impact your work when you get something like this coming from the president?
I cannot waste time and energy on people who are telling me how to fly this airplane. That is my job. My job is to fly this aircraft with everyone in my plane. And this guy is claiming that he rode on an airplane twice and probably owns an airplane and that he can fly it for me. But at the same time, like it does have after effects, and it has profound effects on my work life and getting us PPE and my coworkers, you know, being able to wake up every day and do the job that they do. Paying off our student loans, the fact that we still struggle with that. I mean, the 7 p.m. applause can only do so much. Like, yes, it does have impact on the day-to-day things, and we can only do so much with what we have, the hands that we're dealt. And so we just have to pick our battles and just put our minds to it and just focus on just getting to the next day and getting to the next day.
Paula, you're in Rio, one of the most important research institutions in the region, and I suspect Calvin would probably ask if Bolsonaro went to the same medical school as Donald Trump, because he took much the same approach. But it's interesting to look at the region. You know, Brazil had one approach. Argentina went with the lockdown. So talk to us about regionally what you saw and how things end here this year, and what's the view looking ahead to 2021?
Just a comment. It's just so bad to feel so relatable with this bad aspect of political leadership, because we know that health is not only in our hands as doctors, nurses, researchers, scientists, but it depends on political adequacy and the really value on how important and how on their hands are the decisions on health. So what we've seen since the beginning of this pandemic was a lot of misinformation and fake news. And when they are spread by our politicians, it makes everything worse because supposedly they are the ones leading the country and giving the most trustable information. And when we cannot trust on our political guidance, on what can we trust? So talking about a bit of the lockdowns and all the politics that were decided in Latin America, it was also hard to deal with so many discrepancies between the countries because not as in the European Union, how they made a concise and in unison plan. Here, all the countries took decisions and even the states inside the countries took different decisions. So what we've seen is that many of the restrictions on travel and how this affects, especially in Latin America, when we have so many health inequalities and inequalities in general. So even inside the same country, even inside the same city, if you change the neighborhood that you are, you're going to realize how the impact of bad decisions, the bad political decisions are influencing the people, and especially the most vulnerable ones. How can you stop the contamination and avoid the contamination of people when they are requested to wash their hands but they don't have quality water in their house, or they are asked to keep distance but they need to use the same room for more than 10 people. So these problems and these issues, they were here before COVID, and unfortunately they will be here after the pandemic is over. So again, the importance of political leadership to solve all the issues and to really reinforce the importance of universal health coverage and the importance of access to health is really like showing up to our faces in the baddest way.
You know, Joseph, Paula there was talking about inequality. You and I actually did a podcast earlier this year in which we talked about how this COVID pandemic has affected minorities more than other groups here in the United States, especially African Americans. They were infected at a high rate, they suffered more mortalities, and it was very difficult for minorities to deal with the crisis. In many instances, they come from poorer backgrounds, very difficult for them to socially distance because they live in crowded conditions. Talk to us about how this pandemic has affected minority groups here in the United States.
Well, it's had a profound impact on the country writ large because it exposed a lot of issues and a lot of problems that we have, inequality that had been dormant beneath the surface that people kind of knew about, but it exposed it in real life and in real time. You had entire neighborhoods that lost somebody on every block, somebody on every other house in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And it revealed a lot of problems that the government has not addressed at all. Certainly we had a death toll, almost, you mentioned that the mortality rate among African-Americans of COVID was almost, towards the end of the year, almost 3 times that of whites. Native Americans on reservations, distant reservations where there isn't a lot of water access to wash hands and keep clean and keep socially distant. That was another problem. Mortality rates for higher than 3 times. So it was just remarkable. And the fact that there was not necessarily an addressing of this early on in the pandemic was also quite frustrating to a lot of people. They were screaming about the fact that over decades, African Americans had earned less money, had access to less quality housing, had less access to health insurance and access to a physician. All those things kind of piled up on top of the fact that you had a disproportionate number of African Americans working in frontline jobs. Think retail, think transportation, think sanitation, think those kinds of public jobs where you have an interface between you and the public. That was a recipe for disaster. So you have a lot of African Americans in those jobs that got sick, were infecting other people, maybe going home to houses where their grandmother lived, and they had multi-generational people in those houses because they didn't have access to larger places because they were out of reach. So it compounded one problem on top of another on top of another.
And that's where we have to end it for this part of the review. Paula, Calvin, thanks so much for being with us. Joseph, stay with us for our next panel.
In addition to the nearly 2 million people who died from COVID-19 this year, the world lost a number of notable personalities.
Let's take a moment to remember some of them. While the coronavirus cast a long shadow, many other stories also left their mark on 2020.
Fires scorched southern Australia, the U.S. West Coast, and the Amazon rainforest.
Tropical storms lashed the globe. Super Typhoon Goni slammed the Philippines as the strongest storm to ever make landfall. And the Atlantic hurricane season broke records, spawning the most named storms ever, 30 in all.
Add in historic swarms of desert locusts. They devastated already fragile croplands in East Africa, Southern Asia, and the Middle East.
Iran admitted it shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane. The Revolutionary Guard mistook it for a missile. 176 people perished aboard the flight from Tehran to Kiev.
An explosion leveled the port of Beirut. It killed more than 200 people and scarred Lebanon's landscape for kilometers. The cause? 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate stored unsafely for years. In a most complex divorce, Brexit saw the United Kingdom leave the European Union in January. The two sides finally reach a trade deal at the end of the year.
Parasite.
Parasite dominated the Academy Awards. The South Korean thriller became the first non-English language film to win for Best Picture. It also took home Oscars for Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best International Feature Film.
China made strides in space. The country completed the network of satellites for its Baidu navigation system. It launched a lander rover to Mars, which should arrive early next year. And it became the third country to collect rock samples from the moon.
Protesters took to the streets across Latin America, mostly against austerity and corruption. Chile wrote a new constitution. Peru had 3 presidents in just 1 week. And Bolivia returned to the left, paving a path for its former president and first indigenous leader, Evo Morales, to return after a year in exile. And China achieves a major milestone, announcing it ended extreme poverty nationwide.
Another key story was the racial justice movement that swept the United States.
I Can't Breathe became a rallying cry after the death of George Floyd, a black man killed by a white police officer.
And the ramifications are still being felt. Dan Williams looks back.
At just after 8 p.m., police were called to Cup Foods, a grocery store in a suburb of Minneapolis. They were responding to a call placed by a store employee alleging customer George Floyd had attempted to buy a pack of cigarettes with a counterfeit bill.
Step out and face away. Please don't shoot me, please.
Derek Chauvin and the other officers attempt to put Floyd in a police car. Floyd falls to the ground.
I appreciate that, I do.
He lays there, face down, in handcuffs.
You got your
Chauvin puts his left knee on Floyd's neck. 7 minutes and 46 seconds pass. Floyd is eventually taken away in an ambulance. About an hour later, Floyd is pronounced dead.
Did I just watch a modern-day lynching?
As the videos of Floyd's death become widely shared on social media, protests begin in Minneapolis. They quickly spread across the country. Floyd was not the first African American killed by police in 2020. In March, in Louisville, Kentucky, Breonna Taylor, an emergency room technician, was shot and killed after police officers barged into her apartment with a no-knock warrant. In August, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, police responded to a 911 call about a domestic disturbance. Jacob Blake, an African American, was shot multiple times by a police officer. Blake survived, but is paralyzed from the waist down. The shooting again sparked major protests across the nation. On the third night of protests in Kenosha, Kyle Rittenhouse gunned down 2 protesters and wounded another. He faces intentional, reckless, and attempted homicide charges. But Rittenhouse has also become a symbol for right-wing conservatives and for gun rights. These are just some of the high-profile deaths and shootings of Black Americans. Some were caught on camera. Protest groups, including Black Lives Matter, say many more were not. 2020 laid bare racial tensions in America. Difficult questions and answers remain. Dan Williams, CGTN.
To discuss race issues and politics in the United States, Joseph Williams is still with us. He is senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report right here in Washington, D.C.
Also from Washington, D.C., Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist.
And from New York, Aaron Mate is a journalist and host of the podcast Pushback with Aaron Mate.
Joseph, you know, over this past year, we saw major demonstrations sweep across the country in towns and cities across the United States. We saw people take to the streets. We even saw demonstrations outside the country in cities around the world. What is your view as we come towards the end of the year on social justice in the United States?
Well, my view is that it's firmly on the agenda. You saw that early in the spring with the death of George Floyd, which was broadcast around the world, as you said, and inspired protests all over, particularly notable in France, where they have their own racial problems to deal with. But here in the U.S., it became a part of the agenda because it reached not just into the black community, but beyond. You had suburban mothers protesting in Portland, Oregon, and you had protests outside of Washington, D.C., sustained for many, many months, or many weeks rather, and it was something that people have been talking about in the black community and pleading to be recognized for a long, long time. And it's tragic that it took George Floyd's death for it to happen, but it is firmly on the agenda. You saw it in Biden's speeches and in how he was able to assemble his cabinet.
Adolfo, it's interesting when you look at the 2016 campaign that Donald Trump said that he was going to basically bridge this divide and try and heal the wounds. Some would argue that he's actually stoked some of the divisions. What's your verdict as he leaves office on this issue?
Well, a couple of things. I completely have a different view about what transpired this year. I think the country was very briefly united on the horrific death of George Floyd, and then the entire movement was hijacked by extremists and leftists, and I don't know what they're talking about in terms of social justice. In this country, we have made such enormous advances in terms of racial equality, and I believe that, for example, the election of a black president, members of Congress. What is the social justice that they're advocating for? It became a leftist agenda for division, identity politics, and I think minorities such as myself and many African Americans saw through it. And the demonstration is how well the president did in the polls, and more importantly, I should say, in the election.
But Adolfo, we also saw how black people were disproportionately treated by police in this country. I mean, we saw black people die at the hands of police in the United States.
You know, the statistics speak for themselves. In 2019, 40 Americans in a country of 330 million died at the hands of the police unarmed. The majority were white. Now, I'm not justifying the death of anybody, but this assault on the police is ridiculous. The disproportionate reality, and we have to speak about it, is the highest crime areas in the country are in the poorest communities, which are usually Latino and Hispanic. That is the reason you have these statistics, not because there's 1950-style fascist police tactics. It's just ludicrous, and it's a division of the country that is totally unnecessary and a false narrative.
Aaron, I want to bring you into the conversation, but before I do, Joseph, I'd like to see if you have a response to what he just said.
I've got a few responses, quite frankly. I mean, he's talking about the number of people who died in raw terms. Disproportionately, by 2 times, African Americans are more likely to die at the hands of police. Yes, the numbers are small, but when you look at percentages, it's quite high and quite remarkable. We've just had another police shooting that took place in Louisiana this week of an unarmed man. So it is ludicrous for him to suggest that this is not a problem. It's also ludicrous for him to suggest that this was hijacked by leftist agenda, because we have a president of the United States who is acknowledging that he owes his presidency to the black vote and has made it imperative upon himself to make a diverse cabinet unlike any other, even including Obama's.
Aaron, let me bring you into the conversation. We're just 3 weeks away from the inauguration of Joe Biden. Was this election an election about Biden and his policies, or was this a referendum on 4 years of Trump in the White House?
I think it was foremost a referendum on Trump's handling of the pandemic. He delayed a response. He denied the severity of the problem at first, and we learned that from the leaked audio that came out of his conversations with Bob Woodward. And he presided over the tanking of the economy. I don't think Democrats did a very good job in challenging Trump for these 4 years, and I think that if not for the pandemic, Trump would have had a much better chance of winning. But the fact is, you saw Trump presiding over a pandemic. He mocked people who wear masks, and then he caught the virus himself. You have years of race baiting, dog whistling, speaking about people of color and immigrants in really derogatory terms. And I think all these things, culminating in mishandling the pandemic, is ultimately what did him. And I don't think it was a huge vote of confidence in Joe Biden.
Adolfo, so much was changed, not just in the United States, but around the world by the pandemic. But let's look at its political impact, or the impact on politics, I should say. Do you agree that Donald Trump would have won re-election had it not been for the pandemic?
Oh, unquestionably. There's just no doubt in my mind. And I think that had the announcement of for example, the vaccine had come before the election, I think he, with the pandemic, would have won re-election. In terms of truth-telling, it was NBC News and other media that in May called fact-checking, saying that the development of a vaccine this calendar year was impossible. So they used the pandemic and COVID as they politicized it as a political weapon against the president. I absolutely do believe he would have won re-election. And I also believe that had it been other than Joe Biden, he would have defeated Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, even with the narrative and the press totally against him.
Joseph, Trump's going to be leaving office in just a few weeks. I remember Eisenhower said after Joseph McCarthy fell from grace, it's not McCarthyism anymore, it's McCarthy-wasism. But what about Trumpism? Is Trumpism going to last, or is it going to be Trump-wasism? Because he won't have the bully pulpit he had. He won't be able to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Is it going to impact him, or is he still going to be a force to be reckoned with?
I choose the latter. I think he's still going to be a force to be reckoned with. I mean, certainly he's going to be weakened without all the trappings of the presidency, but he will still have a megaphone and may have one through a TV network, some kind of deal. He may buy one himself. He may be a frequent guest on another one. But I think that he captured the imagination in a really strange way. I think there's a lot of people, and you look at the amount of people who are still involved in this bid to overturn the Democratic election, that indicates that his philosophy is certainly not going anywhere, and he is taking the oxygen out of the room for the 2024 presidential candidates who might want to run for the nomination. And just one other thing, I mean, if we're talking about the power of Trump, certainly he lost by the largest number of popular votes, 7 million. That was more than Hillary Clinton defeated him by. She only had 3 million more popular votes than he did, and he won by a large electoral college margin. So I don't think it was just the pandemic, because you had a president throughout his 4 years in office had among the lowest rates approval ratings in history.
Aaron Mattei, this was a very hard-fought election campaign that we saw there. In the end, Joe Biden did win the election. It's now been confirmed by the Electoral College here in the United States. We saw a lot of rejoicing on the streets in some cities around the country when Joe Biden was declared the winner. But does it really signal change in this country, or are we going to see more of the same, business as usual?
I think Joe Biden said it best himself when he told donors privately that nothing will fundamentally change. I think, look, even in my neighborhood, I live in Brooklyn, and in the wealthier neighborhoods, there were joyous celebrations in the streets. But then when I walked to the more low-income neighborhoods, I didn't see people out having parties, even though I'm sure there is amongst people of color and low-income communities probably more relief than there is disappointment in seeing Trump lose. But look, we have a problem where Trump did tap into legitimate anger in this country about the failing neoliberal system. Now, he harnessed that by appealing to bigotry and xenophobia and hate, but there are also a lot of people who are just genuinely upset with the system. And when Trump promised to drain the swamp, they were so fed up with what had come before that they decided to take a chance on him. And that that sentiment is not going away. And I do think that Trump or someone like him will continue to tap into it. In the absence of a genuine initiative by the Democrats to really address the suffering that's out there. Now, I'm personally not seeing that so far.
Joseph, let me ask you a question from a journalism standpoint. Donald Trump could give you 5, 6 lead stories a day. Are things going to be boring now under a Biden administration?
Well, I mean, certainly it's not going to be the thrill ride that it was under Trump. Boring, I don't think that's the right adjective to use. He was elected on a mandate to return to normal, and I think that's what we'll see. Press briefings, regular information coming out of the White House that's factual and not untrue, or at least as close to factual as a presidential administration would want it to be. But I think that ultimately he will have to be held to account as much as, if not more than Trump, and I think that Trump has invigorated the press to have scrutiny on its leaders in a way that hadn't been before. So I think Biden may be normalizing or resetting a relationship with the press, but I don't think he's going to get an easy ride.
And that's where we have to leave it. We'd like to thank our panelists for being with us. And now it's time to take a look at how U.S. politics shaped the world in 2020.
President Trump kept pushing his agenda of America first. He severed ties with the World Health Organization and created rifts with European partners.
And there was friction between the two largest economies in the world, the United States and China. CGTN's Nathan King reports from the White House.
January the 15th was the high point in U.S. China relations for 2020. After years of tense negotiations, Vice Premier Liu He and his negotiating team were here at the White House to sign a Phase 1 trade deal. Reading from a letter from Chinese President Xi Jinping, Liu He said the deal was not only good for China and the U.S., but also good for the world. And U.S. President Trump praised the U.S. relationship with China.
Now our efforts have yielded a transformative deal that will bring tremendous benefits to both countries. We have a great relationship with China. We have a great relationship with the leadership of China.
But then came COVID-19. China quickly contained it and conquered the virus, while the U.S. response was slow and haphazard. Then China emerged as a scapegoat in a presidential election year.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all.
In April, the U.S. also pointed the finger at the World Health Organization, claiming the WHO was too focused on China and issued bad advice on the virus outbreak. By midsummer, Trump officially withdrew the U.S. from the WHO and potentially pulled hundreds of millions of dollars of funding during a pandemic. China rejected all the unfounded accusations. In July, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas, on unfounded allegations of spying. China responded by ordering the closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, Sichuan. A whole government approach was launched against China. The Trump administration banned 5G leader Huawei from doing business in the U.S. and sought to cut off its supply chain of advanced semiconductors and pressured allies in Asia and Europe to do the same, with limited success. A campaign against Chinese social media platforms was also launched. With 100 million users in the US, TikTok was the first target. The Trump administration also stepped up interference in China's internal affairs. Sanctions over Chinese treatments of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Sanctions too against mainland officials and businesses in the Hong Kong region after the introduction of a national security law. The White House imposing sanctions over Hong Kong as it tear-gassed demonstrators at home was a contradiction not lost on Hong Kong officials.
For those foreign governments or politicians raising objections to the legislation, one could only lament the double standards they are adopting. All those countries which have pointed their fingers at China have their own national security legislation in place.
Perhaps most destabilizing for the U.S.-China relationship was the Trump administration's policy of closer ties with the Taiwan region. Stepped up diplomatic contacts, increased arms sales, and openly questioning the One China principle, which has been the foundation of the U.S.-China relationship over the past 4 decades, has increased military and diplomatic tensions across the Taiwan Strait. After the most turbulent 4 years in the U.S. China relationship since diplomatic relations were established back in the 1970s, all eyes, of course, now on the incoming Biden administration. Some in his foreign policy team are saying that they would like to restore cooperation on global issues such as climate change. Cooperation and competition may be the watchwords of the new administration, not outright confrontation. But given a year of anti-Chinese rhetoric and action across the United States, there are many in the US Congress and beyond that will resist furiously any rapprochement with Beijing. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
To talk more about international relations in 2020, let's welcome our next panel. From Beijing, Xindo Xu is a senior fellow with the Pangol Institution and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend.
Martin Jacques is a journalist and author of the book When China Rules the World. He joins us from London.
In Brussels, Shada Islam is founder and managing director of New Horizons Project. That's an analysis and strategy company.
And John Sedelides is here in Washington, D.C. He is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors.
Xindo, why don't we start with you? I mean, we just saw Nathan's report. The year certainly started off on the right foot. We had that phase one trade deal between the U.S. and China. Seemed like everything was off to the races. And then all of a sudden, everything went off the rails. Obviously, the relationship between U.S. and China went towards a rather negative way. So describe for us the year, if you will. How hopeful were you at the beginning of the year, and where do the relations stand as we end this year?
Well, at the beginning of the year, we know that unexpectedly, basically China was the first country to be hit by the virus, coronavirus over there, and then it spread to the rest of the world. So you do, right after this, phase one deal, I think there was a kind of optimism, like at least the two countries, the two sides have managed to reach some consensus on how to manage their trade relationship. Based on trade one deal, people were even looking at a possible, second phase of deal between the two countries. But unfortunately, because of the disruption of the pandemic, so basically they failed to achieve the second phase deal. But that's good enough, I guess. Since then, the relationship in terms of trade has been stabilized despite the existence of the tariffs from both sides, So at the end of this year, we know, of course, we are expecting a new administration in Washington. So, and also the expectation is like the phase one deal will continue for a while. And then the two countries will again, pick up where they left and to talk about their trade differences and to try to find an agreement, acceptable to both sides.
Martin, great to see you again. 2020, of course, was the year of the pandemic. China managed to combat the pandemic. It defeated the pandemic in many respects, and that's something that's not widely reported around the world. In fact, if you look at the United States has a very different view of China. In many quarters, China is framed as a threat to the United States. What do you make of a statement like that?
Well, certainly China during the course of this year has been recast, certainly in many American eyes, as a threat. And I think the reason for this is a big change in American attitudes from regarding China to be basically a partner to seeing it as a hegemonic threat to the position of the United States. And of course, it's concentrated in the form of Trump, but it's a bipartisan position. And the pandemic got completely mixed up, of course, with this deterioration in the relationship between the two countries. But I would add to that, actually, in reality, the extraordinary shift over the course of the year. I mean, at the beginning of the year, China was demonized for its handling of the pandemic, condemned in the harshest and most abusive terms. And we finished the year with America with over 300,000 dead and China being remarkably successful in its fight against the pandemic. Now, sure, in America, probably that's not achieved the recognition that it certainly should have done. I sense here, creeping in the UK, for example, to the reflections on the pandemic, the occasional mention that China's done very well.
John, let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump as he leaves the White House. Of course, as you know, he ran with this mantra, "Make America Great Again." It was America first. And of course, he left the Paris Climate Accord and cut funding to the WHO. Some people would contend it's America alone in some respects, also turning his back on the Iran nuclear deal. How do you see those policies, and how will they be viewed in the prism of time, do you think?
I think overall, I mean, regardless of what one thinks of President Trump's personality or his relatively unorthodox leadership style, I think historians will look to see that there will be a series of significant foreign policy successes. As we've discussed already on this program, there's been a reframing of the U.S. China relationship. And it's not just related to what took place with the pandemic, although I think there is a profound loss of trust between Washington and Beijing right now because of the way the virus spread from China. But I think also because of China's geopolitical problems in Asia, with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, with Japan, with Southeast Asia, skirmishes along the India border, and of course the Uyghur human rights issues. So I think that's going to be a major understanding or re-understanding of the China challenge towards the U.S. And I think also Middle East peace is going to be an area where I think President Trump, in retrospect, will be given significant credit for reframing the way Israel and its Sunni Arab allies will work together to achieve diplomatic relations, build up trade, and further constrain Iran. And that'll be interesting when an incoming Biden administration looks to re-engage Iran in ways that will be a 180-degree difference from the Trump administration's policy.
Shindo, what's your response to what John had to say?
Well, you know, like probably start looking at China from Washington's point of view, you would say it's you know, it's all because of China. Now we have a poor relationship, we have a worsening relationship. But I guess if you want to have a thorough understanding of this bilateral relationship, probably you need to take into consideration of the views from both sides. You know, from China's point of view, remember which country launched this trade war. It's a unilateral trade war. We call it a trade war. Sounds like, you know, both nations are involved. Yes, but it was started by Washington, remember? And also it, you know, spread to tech war, a crackdown on the attack on the Chinese company based on slim evidence or no evidence at all. Simply the U.S. see Huawei as a threat because it had advanced technology. So it basically pressured other countries not to accept Huawei technology. Is that a fair competition? Of course, you have a negative response from the Chinese side, seeing Washington dealing Beijing in that way, right? So if you see, there's a lot. I agree with the previous speaker. There's a loss of trust and a loss of confidence in each other. But I guess it's both sides. You cannot blame Beijing unilaterally. I think, you know, people will look back very soon at the Trump administration for this year or for the 4 years. Basically, it creates a lot of trouble around the world. But somehow, when it comes to China, you know, Trump has done everything right. I think this is a bit strange, you know.
Shada Islam, let's talk about the relationship between the United States and Europe. You know, ever since President Trump came to office just under 4 years ago, that relationship has deteriorated. We, of course, remember when President Trump was talking about America first, when he was berating the Europeans for not pulling their weight, for not contributing enough to their common defense. If you look at that relationship over the past year, how have you seen it evolve?
Well, it's a battered relationship. I wouldn't even call it a relationship. It's really been a divorce, separation for sure. Yes, there's been a lot of American bullying of the Europeans. Donald Trump called the European Union almost an enemy. And so it's been a very, very poisoned and toxic relationship. And I think, you know, now we're really, really coming to the end of it. And when Joe Biden was elected, I mean, there was a massive sigh of relief, and you could basically hear it across the European Union. So we're looking forward to having a more predictable and a more Europe-friendly president in the White House. But having said that, I mean, this was also a moment of maturity and coming of age for the European Union, you know, having sort of disconnected a little bit from the United States. The EU has been trying for the last 4 years to come out of America's shadow, to stand on its own 2 feet. And I'm sure everyone here has heard about the strategic autonomy conversations that are going on across the European Union, with France really spearheading that drive. So it's been a coming of age moment. There's been a lot of mourning and grief for a relationship that's finished, but now there's hope that there'll be, let's say, a revitalization of this very important transatlantic relationship.
John Charles Kupchan is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. He recently wrote an article where he basically said to Joe Biden he should keep some aspects of Trump's foreign policy, reducing troop commitments in the Middle East, perhaps a more muscular foreign trade approach. Do you agree, and do you think he's likely to follow that advice?
No, I think it makes sense. I mean, this would be the advice one would give to any incoming administration. You don't necessarily have to reject all of the policies of the prior administration. And I think there is some agreement that there are very important aspects of the Trump foreign policy that will carry forward in a very positive way for the United States and for our allies in Asia, in Europe, and around the world. So those areas, I think Biden is going to be very smart to continue where necessary, especially as it pertains to the Indo-Pacific region. But I think also there are going to be some serious problems with the U.S. policy towards Iran. President Trump had essentially a no better friend, no worse enemy strategy in the Middle East, and the idea that Biden might revert to an Obama administration policy on the JCPOA means we will harm our relations with Israel and harm our relations with Sunni Arab countries.
Shana, you know, we talked a moment ago about the Iranian nuclear deal. I mean, if there's something that's really distinguished the United States foreign policy over the past few years, it's Donald Trump's policy of looking inwards, of America first, and unilateral in many instances. But with Joe Biden now coming to office, do you see that term multilateralism coming back?
Yes, that is absolutely right. I mean, there are real strong hopes here in Brussels and across the European Union that what we call effective multilateralism, you know, coming back to the WTO, reinvesting in the World Health Organization, reinvesting in the United Nations per se, there are hopes that Biden will do that. And I think some of his choices for key posts in his incoming administration showed that there is a recognition that America has to come back to the global table. But having said that, I think in Europe we also realize that the world has changed a lot in the last 4 years. I mean, it's not just America first vis-a-vis European Union, but the rest of the world. And of course, the rise of China, the emergence of India, the important role being played by Japan, the need for action in Africa, all of these priorities are very much there as well. So yes, Biden should come back, but he shouldn't expect to be, as he said himself, that he wants to be the leader again. I think the world has changed a lot, and leading this new world is going to require more than just one country. It requires alliances and coalitions. That's what the Biden administration will have to realize.
And Shindo, we know that China also signed on to this nuclear deal. How do they view all of this changing landscape, this new world order, if you will, as 2020 comes to a close?
Well, for China, you know, China has always been espousing the idea of a multilateral world. Of course, the U.S. does not welcome this concept, but the world has changed, as the previous speaker pointed out. You know, with the rise of China, rise of India, and the regional blocs in different parts of the world. I would say, you know, like multilateralism has never been absent. You know, not long ago, there's an agreement, comprehensive agreement, that is RCEP trade agreement, 16 countries, you know, in Asia-Pacific region. So that is something, that is the commitment of the Asian Pacific countries, a commitment to multilateralism, a commitment to free trade, despite the practice of unilateralism and American first by the Trump administration. Of course, with the Biden, the administration upcoming, I would say, in general, people welcome if there's a return of multilateralism. When it comes to this, the nuclear issue, like Iranian nuclear issue, that's a good example. Successful agreement, successful effort by multiple players to solve a very thorny issue. But unfortunately, it was rolled back somewhat. And hopefully, it will be dealt with effectively with the participation of the major powers like European Union, Germany, France, China, UK, and the United States. Hopefully, they will be able to maintain peace and stability in that region.
Martin, talking about the relationship between the United States and China, one term that we heard very often over the past year was that term decoupling, decoupling the economies of the two countries. I mean, it's a nice, catchy term, but is it feasible?
Well, I think to some extent that is what has been happening. And I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't in some shape or form continue. I mean, this is not just a question of trade. Probably more important in relationship to this is the question of technology. And that's where, in some ways, the Trump administration was most aggressive. Interestingly, China is accused of economic coercion, but actually, the real economic coercion of the last 4 years has been, I would say, primarily at the behest of the United States. We're going to see a stronger orientation by China, first to its own market, and secondly to East Asia, as evidenced, for example, by the RCEP agreement, which represents a third of the global economy. So I think that the West should not assume that that China will be as dependent as it has previously been with the Western economy, but will actually begin to plow a slightly different. I mean, this is going to be a huge change, but it's a strategic tendency. And of course, China speaks from strength here, because the other thing we should add here, is it not, that China is going to come out of this year economically strengthened, and the United States and even more Europe seriously weakened. So China, we've got to look beyond the immediate situation and see where things are moving. And it seems to me that is the way things are moving. So China's position is getting stronger.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is our wrap on the discussion about 2020, which, by the way, was declared by Time magazine as the worst year ever.
And we are not going to argue with them. On a look back at history, though, might help put 2020 in perspective. For instance, in 1349, the Black Death plague killed an estimated 25 million people across Europe. Just a century ago, we had the Spanish flu pandemic that killed at least 50 million people worldwide.
Medieval historians say the year 536 was one of the worst periods. That's when a mysterious fog plunged Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into darkness for 18 months. In the summer, snow fell in China. Crops were decimated and people starved.
So 2020 was a difficult year, but the coming vaccines hold promise of a better tomorrow. Stay with CGTN as we look forward to 2021.
My hope for 2021 is that COVID will be gone for good forever, and we can come back to normal, lives will be saved, and we can live happily ever after.
My hopes for 2021 are that we all get through this pandemic and that we have a peaceful and healthy new year.
Hoping that in 2021 we'll finally be able to get together with friends and family, also go out for events, go out to the bar, go out to the movies, and socially gather once again.
Really looking forward to 2021 because last year was not great. We're looking for an improved automotive industry, but we're also looking for happiness and health for everyone going in the future. Happy New Year.